The first envelope arrived on a rainy Monday morning. It was plain white, with no return address. Only David Harper's name printed neatly across the front. At 68 years old, David had learned that the most important news rarely arrived with bright colors or cheerful greetings. He placed the envelope beside his coffee mug and watched the rain slide slowly down the kitchen window. The house was quiet, just as it had been every morning since his wife Margaret passed away 6 years earlier. Silence had become so familiar that it no longer felt empty. It simply felt like another room in the house. He finally opened the envelope and unfolded the papers inside. The first page was a notice from the county property office confirming that Harper Engineering Workshop had officially changed ownership 18 months earlier. David frowned. There had to be a mistake. The workshop was not just a business. It had been his life's work for more than 4 decades. Every machine that left his shop carried a small brass plate engraved with the words, "Built to last." He had never sold a company. His hands trembled slightly as he turned to the next page. It was a notarized transfer agreement, and at the bottom was his signature. He stared at it for nearly a minute. It looked exactly like his handwriting. Every letter matched. Every curve was perfect, yet he knew, with absolute certainty, that he had never signed away his business. His thoughts drifted back 3 years to the day they buried Margaret. The funeral had ended beneath gray skies, and people had surrounded him with comforting words that he barely heard. Friends promised to visit. Neighbors offered to help. His only son, Ethan, stayed beside him the entire afternoon, carrying flowers, speaking to relatives, and making sure his father never stood alone. As they loaded the last arrangements into Ethan's truck, he placed a reassuring hand on David's shoulder and quietly said, "You don't have to worry about anything anymore, Dad. I'll handle all the paperwork." David had simply nodded. His mind was too clouded with grief to think about bank accounts, insurance policies, or legal documents. Margaret had always managed those things. During their 42 years of marriage, David built machines while Margaret organized their life. She remembered birthdays, balanced the checkbook, renewed insurance policies, and made sure every bill was paid before it was due. Without her, the smallest administrative task suddenly felt overwhelming. Accepting Ethan's help seemed natural. After all, that's what family was supposed to do. Ethan Harper was 40 years old and successful by every outward measure. He worked in commercial real estate, drove an expensive black SUV, wore tailored suits, and spoke with the confidence of someone who always expected to get his way. He often described business with the same phrase, "Everything is an asset if you know how to use it." David had never liked hearing those words. To him, people and memories were not assets. They were responsibilities. Margaret had noticed that difference years before. One quiet evening, while washing dishes together, she had said, "Your son has a kind heart, David. I'm just afraid he's learning how to ignore it." David remembered laughing at the time, convinced that she was worrying too much. Looking back now, he wished he had listened more carefully. During the months after Margaret's death, Ethan visited almost every weekend. He arrived with groceries, organized file cabinets, answered calls from accountants, and insisted on handling anything involving paperwork. David was grateful. He had spent his entire adult life solving mechanical problems, not reading legal documents. Every time Ethan placed another stack of forms on the kitchen table, he explained them in simple language. Insurance update, tax renewal, business registration, just routine paperwork. "Dad," David signed wherever Ethan pointed. One afternoon, Ethan arrived carrying a thick blue folder. "This one is important," he said. "What is it?" David asked, adjusting his reading glasses. "But it's just restructuring the business. Nothing changes for you. It simply makes things easier if something ever happens." David flipped through the pages, but the legal language quickly blurred together. Margaret had always insisted they read every document twice before signing anything. She used to joke that lawyers made money by hiding important sentences between boring ones. David smiled sadly at the memory before picking up his pen. "You trust me, don't you?" Ethan asked gently. David looked at his son. He saw the little boy who used to spend Saturdays sweeping the workshop floor and pretending broken gears were pirate treasure. He He saw the teenager who proudly wore grease-covered overalls during summer vacations. He saw his only child. "Of course I do," David replied. He signed every page. Over the following year, small things began changing around the workshop. Suppliers who had called David personally for decades now asked to speak with Ethan. Customers congratulated Ethan on taking over the company. New invoices arrived addressed to Ethan Harper instead of David Harper. Whenever David questioned it, Ethan laughed. "Just accounting updates, Dad. You're still the boss." David wanted to believe him, so he did. The first real warning came from Frank Miller, a welder who had worked beside David for nearly 25 years. One afternoon, Frank quietly closed the workshop door behind them and asked, "Can I ask you something without offending you?" David smiled. "When have you ever worried about offending me?" Frank hesitated. "Are you retiring?" "No." "Then why did Ethan introduce himself as the owner during yesterday's supplier meeting?" David stared at him. "What are you talking about?" Frank looked genuinely confused. "He said you wanted to spend more time resting and that he'd officially taken over the company last year." David laughed, but the sound felt forced. "There must be some misunderstanding." Frank nodded politely, though the expression on his face suggested he didn't believe that explanation. That evening, David drove home more slowly than usual. He couldn't stop replaying the conversation in his mind. He opened the filing cabinet where Margaret had always kept important documents, hoping to reassure himself that everything was in order. Instead, he found several folders missing. The business ownership papers were gone. So were the original property deeds. At first, he assumed Ethan had borrowed them for tax purposes, but a strange feeling settled in his stomach. It was the same feeling Margaret used to call the quiet alarm. She believed everyone possessed an inner voice that recognized danger long before the mind accepted it. When something feels wrong, she often said, don't argue with the feeling. Investigate it. For the first time since her death, David realized he had ignored that voice for far too long. Certainly, here's part 2 rewritten as a smooth, continuous narrative in paragraph form, similar to the style of a novel. David hardly slept that night. Every time he closed his eyes, Frank's question echoed in his mind. Why did Ethan introduce himself as the owner? He tried to convince himself that there had to be an innocent explanation. Perhaps Frank had misunderstood, or maybe Ethan had simply spoken carelessly during the meeting. But the uneasy feeling in his chest refused to leave. Margaret had always believed that instincts deserved respect. Whenever something felt wrong, she never ignored it. She investigated until the truth revealed itself. Sitting alone in the dark, David realized that he had ignored his own instincts for far too long. The following morning, he arrived at the workshop before anyone else. The building looked exactly as it had for decades, yet somehow it felt unfamiliar. The smell of machine oil, fresh steel, and sawdust had always comforted him, but now even those familiar scents carried an uncomfortable weight. He walked slowly through the workshop, running his hand across machines he had designed with his own hands years earlier. Every corner of the building held memories of long evenings spent working beside Margaret, who often brought him coffee while he finished orders late into the night. Together, they had built the business from almost nothing. There had been months when they survived on canned soup, because every spare dollar went toward buying new equipment. Looking around now, David couldn't imagine giving all of it away voluntarily. He entered his office and unlocked the old filing cabinet where Margaret had carefully organized every important document. At first glance, everything seemed normal, but after checking each drawer, he noticed several folders were missing. The original property deed was gone. The business ownership certificates had disappeared. Even the insurance files Margaret had labeled in her neat handwriting were nowhere to be found. David searched the cabinet again, this time more slowly, hoping he had simply overlooked them. When he finished, he knew the truth. Someone had removed them deliberately. Without wasting another minute, he called Ethan. His son answered almost immediately, sounding relaxed. "Morning, Dad. I'm at the workshop," David said. "Everything okay?" "The ownership papers are missing." There was a brief silence before Ethan answered. "I took them a while ago." David frowned. "Why?" "They were needed for refinancing." "Refinancing what?" "The company." David's confusion deepened. The workshop doesn't have any debt. It was just routine business planning, Dad. Ethan replied quickly. Don't worry about it. I'll explain everything this weekend. I'd rather understand it today. I'm busy all day. We'll talk soon, I promise. Before David could ask another question, the call ended. He lowered the phone slowly. The words "trust me" had once brought comfort. Now they sounded like a warning. Instead of returning to work, David drove directly to the county property office downtown. He approached the public records counter and politely explained that he wanted to review the ownership history of Harper Engineering Workshop. The young clerk smiled, asked him to wait a few minutes, and disappeared into the records room. When she returned, she handed him a thin folder. David opened it, expecting to find decades of familiar documents. Instead, the very first page stopped him cold. 18 months earlier, ownership of Harper Engineering Workshop had legally transferred to a holding company called Harper Industrial Holdings, LLC. The registered owner of that company was Ethan Harper. David's heart pounded as he turned to the next page. There it was again, his own signature, perfectly reproduced at the bottom of the transfer agreement. The notarization was valid. Every legal requirement had been completed. According to every official record in the county, David Harper had willingly transferred ownership of the business to his son. He stared at the document for a long time before quietly saying, "I never signed this." The clerk looked at him with sympathy. "If you believe the transfer wasn't legitimate, you should speak with an attorney." David thanked her and walked outside, but instead of driving away, he sat inside his truck with both hands resting on the steering wheel. His mind replayed every conversation he'd had with Ethan during the previous 2 years. The blue folder, the stack of papers, the reassuring smile, the words, "You're just making things easier, Dad." He finally understood what Margaret had always warned him about. Trust without verification was not kindness. Sometimes it was simply an opportunity waiting to be exploited. That afternoon, instead of going home, David drove to the cemetery where Margaret was buried. He sat quietly on the bench beside her headstone while the wind moved gently through the trees. For nearly an hour, he spoke to her as though she were sitting beside him. He told her about the documents, about the missing files, about the county records that now listed Ethan as the legal owner of everything they had spent 40 years building together. The stack of papers, the reassuring smile, the words, "You're just making things easier, Dad." He finally understood what Margaret had always warned him about. Trust without verification was not kindness. Sometimes it was simply an opportunity waiting to be exploited. That afternoon, instead of going home, David drove to the cemetery where Margaret was buried. He sat quietly on the bench beside her headstone while the wind moved gently through the trees. For nearly an hour, he spoke to her as though she were sitting beside him. He told her about the documents, about the missing files, about the county records that now listed Ethan as the legal owner of everything they had spent 40 years building together. "I should have listened to you," he whispered. "You always read every document before signing it." A faint smile crossed his face through the sadness. "You would have caught this in 5 minutes." Before leaving, he rested his hand on the cool granite. "I don't know how yet," he said softly, "but I promise you one thing. I'm going to make this right." 3 days later, Ethan arrived at David's house carrying grocery bags, smiling as though nothing had happened. He placed them on the kitchen counter and began unpacking them while casually asking how the week had been. David waited until they were both seated before placing copies of the county records on the table between them. "I went downtown," he said calmly. Ethan glanced at the papers but didn't pick them up. "I thought you might. You own my company." "It's still your company in every practical sense." David slowly shook his head. "No, Ethan. Legally, it belongs to you." His son leaned back in his chair and folded his arms. "Dad, you're making this sound much worse than it really is." "Then explain it." "I already did. It's asset protection. It keeps everything in the family." David looked at him steadily. "I never agreed to give you my business. You signed the documents. I trusted you. I never forced you." The words struck David harder than anger ever could. Ethan wasn't denying what had happened. He was justifying it. "I asked you what those papers were," David said quietly. "And I told you." "No," David replied, meeting his son's eyes without raising his voice. You told me whatever you thought would make me sign them. For the first time, Ethan seemed uncomfortable. He looked away toward the kitchen window before speaking again. You weren't thinking clearly after Mom died. David remained silent. You were grieving, Ethan continued. You forgot things. I thought it was better if someone else handled the business. So you decided that someone should be you. I was protecting what our family built. David stood slowly and walked toward the window, overlooking the workshop in the distance. Your mother and I built that business, he said. We worked weekends. We mortgaged our home twice. We skipped vacations for nearly 20 years because every dollar went back into that company. You inherited memories, Ethan. You did not inherit ownership. Neither man spoke for several moments. Finally, Ethan stood and picked up his jacket. I don't think this conversation is helping. David turned toward him. No, he said quietly. For the first time in a long while, I think it finally is. Ethan left without another word. David remained standing in the silent kitchen until the sound of his son's car disappeared down the road. The sadness was still there, but something else had replaced the confusion. Clarity. The next morning, he called Samuel Brooks, an elderly estate attorney who had handled Margaret's parents' wills decades earlier. Samuel listened patiently as David explained everything from beginning to end without interrupting. When the story was finished, the lawyer remained silent for several moments before asking a single question. David, do you still have copies of the documents you signed? No, David answered. Good. David frowned. Why is that good? Because your son probably believes you have no idea what really happened. I don't understand. Samuel's voice became calm and deliberate. People who think they've already won usually stop being careful. If Ethan believes you're confused, he'll eventually make a mistake. Our job isn't to prove you were betrayed. He paused before adding the sentence that changed everything. Our job is to prove exactly how he betrayed you. David looked out the window as the morning rain began falling again. For the first time since Margaret's death, he no longer felt helpless. He had stopped asking what had happened. Now he was going to uncover every detail of how it had happened. Samuel Brooks had practiced law for nearly 50 years, and experience had taught him one lesson above all others. The truth was most powerful when it was allowed to reveal itself. When David arrived at Samuel's office the following morning, carrying a worn leather folder filled with every document he could find, the elderly attorney didn't begin by discussing lawsuits or courtrooms. Instead, he poured 2 cups of coffee, pushed one across the desk, and said, "Before we decide how to fight this, we need to understand exactly what we're fighting." For the next 4 hours, they reconstructed the previous 3 years of David's life. Samuel asked for dates rather than emotions. He wanted to know when Ethan first offered to help with paperwork, when the blue folder appeared, when suppliers stopped calling David directly, and when customers first began referring to Ethan as the owner. At first, David struggled to remember every detail, but years of running a business had trained him to think systematically. Gradually, the timeline became clear. Every event fit together with unsettling precision. Ethan had not acted impulsively. He had worked patiently, waiting until grief had clouded his father's judgment before placing legal documents in front of him, one signature at a time. Samuel leaned back in his chair after reviewing the timeline. "This wasn't a misunderstanding," he said quietly. "It was a plan." David lowered his eyes. "I keep asking myself how I didn't see it." "You were grieving," Samuel replied. "Grief changes how people evaluate trust. It doesn't make them foolish. It makes them vulnerable. There's a difference." Those words stayed with David long after he left the office. For months he had blamed himself for being careless. Samuel's explanation didn't erase the pain, but it gave a name. Over the following weeks, they began gathering evidence. Samuel hired a forensic accountant to examine the financial records of Harper Engineering Workshop. David expected the investigation to confirm only the ownership transfer. Instead, it uncovered something far more disturbing. During the 18 months after Ethan became the legal owner, the workshop had quietly borrowed nearly $2 million against its assets. Machines that David had spent decades paying for had been used as collateral for risky commercial investments. The company had also begun guaranteeing loans for several real estate projects connected to Ethan's business ventures. None of those decisions had anything to do with manufacturing equipment. They had everything to do with financing Ethan's growing empire. David stared silently at the accountant's report. "I spent 40 years building something stable," he said. Samuel nodded. "And someone else spent 18 months gambling with it." The realization hurt more than losing ownership itself. David had always believed that businesses should grow slowly, supported by honest work and careful planning. Ethan believed in leverage, expansion, and aggressive borrowing. The workshop had become a financial tool instead of a family legacy. Samuel advised patience. "We're not filing anything yet," he said. David looked surprised. "Why wait?" "Because every month he believes you're unaware, he'll leave another trail." Financial fraud usually becomes easier to prove when people grow comfortable. David agreed. The waiting tested every ounce of his patience. Instead of confronting Ethan again, he quietly rebuilt his own life. He accepted a part-time consulting position with a small manufacturing company 2 towns away. The salary was modest, but the work reminded him why he had become an engineer in the first place. He wasn't interested in making millions. He simply enjoyed solving problems. The younger employees quickly discovered that the quiet older man possessed decades of practical knowledge no textbook could teach. Whenever a machine failed, David rarely looked at the computer diagnostics first. He listened to the sound the equipment made while running. "Machines always tell you what's wrong," he often said. "You just have to stop talking long enough to hear them." Within months, people began seeking his advice on projects far beyond his official responsibilities. The company's owner offered him a permanent position, but David declined. "I've already had one career," he said with a smile. "Now I just want to help." Meanwhile, Ethan's life appeared increasingly successful from the outside. Local business magazines featured photographs of him standing beside expensive developments. He received awards from the Chamber of Commerce. Interviews described him as an ambitious entrepreneur transforming regional manufacturing through innovative investment strategies. David clipped every article and placed it in a folder. Not because he admired them, because Samuel had asked him to save everything. "Public success often hides private pressure," the attorney explained. "People who build reputations eventually become prisoners of them." 2 years passed. Then the phone call came. Samuel's voice sounded unusually calm. "I think we found the first crack." The forensic accountant had discovered that several loans secured against Harper Engineering Workshop were now in default. Ethan's real estate investments had begun losing money after a commercial development failed. Banks were demanding repayment, and because the workshop guaranteed many of the loans, the manufacturing business now faced serious financial exposure. David felt no satisfaction, only sadness. "This didn't have to happen," he murmured. "No," Samuel agreed. "It didn't." Several weeks later, David attended a local manufacturing conference as a guest speaker. His presentation focused on building businesses that could survive for generations rather than chasing rapid expansion. Afterward, dozens of young entrepreneurs approached him with questions. One of them asked, "What's the most important lesson you've learned in business?" David paused before answering. "Never confuse ownership with stewardship." The young man frowned. "What do you mean?" David smiled gently. "Just because something legally belongs to you doesn't mean you've earned a right to risk it." The audience applauded politely, unaware that the sentence carried decades of personal experience. That evening, while driving home, David realized something unexpected. For the first time since Margaret's death, he had spoken publicly without feeling broken. The betrayal no longer defined him. It had become only one chapter of a much larger story. When he reached home, he found a letter waiting in his mailbox. The return address belonged to Harper Industrial Holdings. Inside was a formal notice from Ethan requesting a meeting. There was no explanation, only one sentence. "I believe it's time we talk." David folded the letter carefully and placed it beside Samuel's business card on the kitchen table. He looked at Margaret's framed photograph sitting near the window. "I think the waiting is almost over," he said quietly. Outside, the evening sun broke through the clouds for the first time all day, casting long shadows across the old workshop in the distance. David knew that whatever happened next would not simply determine who owned a company. It would determine whether truth, patiently protected, could outlast deception. And if there was one lesson 40 years of building machines had taught him, it was this: anything built on a weak foundation eventually collapses under its own weight. The Last Signature. Part 4. The Last Signature Finale. David left Ethan's letter unopened on the kitchen table for almost 2 days. Years earlier, he would have called his son the moment he saw the envelope. He would have assumed there had been a misunderstanding, searched for the quickest way to repair the relationship, and placed peace above truth. But life had taught him that not every silence needed to be broken immediately. Some decisions became clearer when they were given room to breathe. On the third morning, he carried the letter to Samuel Brooks' office. The elderly attorney adjusted his glasses, read it once, and placed it back on the desk. "That he wants something," Samuel said. "That's what I thought. If this were simply an apology, he wouldn't have sent it through the company." David nodded. "So what do we do?" "We agreed to meet," Samuel replied, "but not alone, and not without knowing exactly where we stand." A week later, they met in a quiet conference room at a downtown law office. Ethan looked older than David remembered. The expensive suit was still there, but the confidence that had once filled every room seemed to have faded. Dark circles rested beneath his eyes, and the careful smile he offered his father disappeared almost as quickly as it appeared. "Thank you for coming, Dad." David took his seat without responding. For several moments, neither man spoke. Finally, Ethan leaned forward. "I'm in trouble." David remained silent. "The banks are calling the loans. The commercial projects failed. Harper Industrial Holdings is close to bankruptcy." David looked at him steadily. "I read about the Riverside development." Ethan lowered his eyes. "I thought it would recover." "It didn't." "No." The room fell quiet again. Then Ethan spoke the words David had expected to hear. "I need your help." Samuel folded his hands on the table, but said nothing. David looked at his son for a long moment before asking the question that had lived inside him for 3 years. "When you asked me to sign those papers, did you already know they transferred ownership?" Ethan closed his eyes. "Yes." "And when I asked what they were?" "Elite." The admission hung in the air. No excuses. No explanations. Just the truth. David felt no satisfaction. Only sadness. "You didn't steal a company," he said quietly. "You stole trust." Ethan nodded, tears beginning to gather in his eyes. "I know." David had imagined this moment hundreds of times. In every version, he thought anger would return. Instead, he felt tired. Samuel finally spoke. "My client has evidence showing exactly how ownership was transferred and how company assets were used afterward. If this proceeds to court, the financial consequences will be significant." Ethan swallowed hard. "I know. My question," Samuel continued, "is whether you're prepared to correct what can still be corrected." For the first time since entering the room, Ethan looked directly at his father. "I'll sign everything back." David studied his son's face. "Why now?" "Because I finally understand what I destroyed." David waited. "It wasn't the business," Ethan continued. "It was us." The words sounded genuine. But David had learned that sincerity and accountability were not always the same thing. "You understand because you're losing everything," David said. Ethan didn't argue. Maybe that's what it took. Over the following month, attorneys prepared a settlement unlike any Samuel had drafted before. Ownership of Harper Engineering Workshop would return entirely to David. Every outstanding loan connected to Ethan's personal developments would be removed from the company through the sale of Ethan's remaining commercial assets. Ethan also agreed to admit, in writing, that the ownership transfer had been obtained through deception and that his father had never knowingly intended to surrender control of the business. Samuel handed David the final document. "This is the last signature," he said. David read every page, every sentence, every line. When he reached the signature block, he smiled softly. Margaret would have been proud. He signed, not because someone had pointed to the bottom of the page, not because someone had promised everything would be easier. He signed because he understood every word. Weeks later, David walked through the workshop for the first time as its legal owner once again. Many things had changed. Some machines had been sold. Several longtime employees had retired. The office walls had been repainted, and the old wooden desk Margaret had chosen decades earlier had been replaced with modern furniture. Still, the building felt familiar. Frank Miller, now preparing for retirement himself, smiled as David entered. "Good to have you back, boss." David laughed. "I think I'll settle for mechanic." Together, they spent the afternoon repairing an old milling machine that had been sitting and used for months. David wiped grease from his hands and realized something unexpected. He wasn't trying to reclaim the past. He was simply grateful to still have a future. Months passed. The workshop became profitable again, not because it expanded aggressively, but because David returned to the principles on which it had been built: honest work, careful planning, and promises that could actually be kept. He hired apprentices instead of consultants. He invested in equipment instead of speculation. The brass plates returned to every machine leaving the workshop. Built to last. One autumn afternoon, Ethan arrived without an appointment. He stood quietly outside the workshop until David noticed him. "I don't want anything," Ethan said. David waited. "I just wondered if maybe I could help for a few hours." David looked around the workshop. Years earlier, the answer would have been immediate. Now he chose his words carefully. "Can you sweep the floor?" Ethan blinked. "That's all." David smiled faintly. "That's where you started when you were 12. Without another word, Ethan picked up the old push broom, leaning against the wall. For the next 3 hours, father and son worked in silence. No dramatic speeches. No instant forgiveness. Only the sound of machines, steel, and a broomy floor. As the sun began to set, Ethan placed the broom back where he had found it. "Thank you," he said quietly. David nodded. "I'll see you next week, if that's all right." David looked at him for a long moment. "I'll be here." It wasn't forgiveness. It wasn't reconciliation. But it was the first honest beginning they had shared in years. That evening, after locking the workshop, David drove to the cemetery carrying a small brass plate in his pocket. He placed it beside Margaret's headstone. It read, "Built to last." He smiled. "You were right," he whispered. "You always told me that character is built one decision at a time." The wind stirred gently through the trees. For the first time in many years, David no longer thought about revenge. Revenge had seemed important when he first discovered the betrayal. He wanted Ethan to feel the same pain he had endured. But somewhere along the way, that desire had changed. Justice had returned his business. Truth had restored his name. Time had given his son the opportunity to become a better man. David realized that revenge would only have left another broken family behind. Justice had left the door open for something better. As he walked back toward his truck, he glanced once more at the workshop standing quietly beneath the evening sky. It wasn't perfect anymore. Neither was he. But both were still standing. And sometimes he thought that is the greatest victory of all.